welcome to this episode of the Gold Hoops and God podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Guerra. Thank you for joining me today. Danielle Guillen is joining us.
Hi.
So Danielle is from the Inland Empire, so a California native. She is Mexican American in background, and so I'm really excited to talk to her today. She is also a social impact consultant, so I'm sure she'll share a little bit about that. And let's dive in. I'm so happy to have you, Danielle.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Yes. So one of the topics that I like to start with my guests is the topic of culture, because even in terms of like identity, even the terminology that we use is very complex, and there is definitely like a different energy behind each term. So for example, like Latinx, Hispanic, there's a variety of terms. And so I'm curious to know a little bit about your background and how you like to self-identify in terms of culture.
No, I think that's such a good question because honestly, I'll be very transparent. I've struggled with this a lot in my life. So I can't remember time talking about this prior, but my mom's family came to Southern California because they were farm workers, and my dad's family came also from Chihuahua. They're both from Chihuahua to the Inland Empire, to the county of San Bernardino, just for like better opportunities. And both sides of my family started coming to the U.S. in like the early 1900s. And so I think this has been such a question for me, especially as I was growing up, and so many folks have just such a more recent connection to their ancestral lands, in my case, like Chihuahua, Mexico. And so oftentimes struggled with this very question. I think culturally, I grew up in a very Chicano like community. And in that, though, what I love is that there were just so many definitions of what that meant for us. For me, it meant a lot of like, culturally, I grew up with a lot of like lowriders. I grew up with like a lot of spins of like traditional Mexican dishes. And I think that as I've been getting older and being able to redefine what Mexican American means, even, and like having a lot more friends and getting to learn from them about like their grandmothers and like their grandparents and their like mom and dad, and getting a sense of like what that means to be from a place and how to bring that to the US. I'm super appreciative of, like, to your question, that for me, Chicano culture really is this really diverse, ever-changing group of cultural norms and like styles and fashions, and what it means to be, I think for me, an active political citizen. And I think a lot of that was inspired by just growing up in a very Chicano culture, just having my grandparents really iterate like having participated in the Chicano rights movement and like really understanding what was happening politically prior to, obviously being born, and then prior to entering and being an adult myself and understanding systems. So I think to your question, for me, the piece of it that's influenced me the most culturally has been actually this emphasis on how do we make political systems recognize and respect cultural norms and just ways of being within the like broader Mexican American community.
I love that. That's amazing. So it seems that even in your family, there was already this connection to like civic responsibility, involvement, protest, rights, like all those kind of questions. Yeah, that's fantastic. That's amazing. And it's so true. So I feel like everyone's experience is so unique. Like you were mentioning, if a family, let's say like that migration is more distant, right? If it was like several hundred years ago, the family's well established in the US for several generations, it's different versus like if a person's mom came directly from El Salvador or Costa Rica or whatever. Yeah, it's unique. It's unique. Each of those experiences is unique.
No, it totally is. And honestly, I think it's something that I truly struggled with identifying for myself, because I feel like a lot of my life, folks have really been trying to wanting to put me in a box culturally. And I don't always feel connected to that interpretation, especially because I have, when we talk about identity and things that make you who you are, like I equally am also like super excited about school. And I remember just growing up, that was like something that was really like created a lot of cognitive dissonance. Like that was hard for even my relatives to like put like wrap around, because they had been denied so many opportunities, right?
Mhm.
And so it was super interesting because I felt like culturally, I honestly really resonate with my friends who are like multiracial and they talk about
Oh,
like
yeah.
culturally just kind of feeling like I don't really know where I truly fit. And
Belong.
then
Mhm.
now I just really view that honestly as a strength. I think it helps me be really curious and interested
Yes.
in
Yes.
specifically how do we currently form culture and what does that
Mhm.
mean, right? Because it's just so shifting, and I think people really try to peg it down. But I
Yeah.
think to your point about like I was raised in a very actively like civically engaged like
Mhm.
family.
Yeah.
And so I think like that's why policy for me and the work I do in social impact is so important to
Yeah.
create those big milestones. But I like that those things shift, right? I like
Totally.
that we're not, well, maybe now we are still fighting for human rights, but like
Right.
different story. But prior,
Mhm.
the last 10 years, we're really fighting for things to create better qualities of life versus like, really fighting for the right to exist. Obviously, not everyone, right? But like, really, for me, that emphasis was like super interesting and a shift of how I thought about like what does it mean to be Mexican American and what does it mean to
Mhm.
be civically engaged in the U.S. and what does my culture mean to me.
Yeah, definitely. I think especially for Latinas, our identity is extremely complex because Latin America is always already diverse and complicated, right? We
Yeah,
have,
it
yeah,
really
it's
is.
like indigenous, African diaspora, Spanish, Portuguese, etc., European presence, colonization. So it's like we're already complicated. And so I think that that makes it even more challenging bringing that to the US, growing up in the United States with a diverse background. And so for myself, like my mom's side of the family were from Guatemala, my dad's side's from Ecuador. So Central and South America. You wouldn't think that it's that different, but even within myself, I will say that it was different, like the Guatemalan culture is different than Ecuadorian culture. It's similar, but different, right? And so even like growing up and navigating that, it takes time. It's a challenge. I think I mentioned on a different episode, like the first time that I met a lot of Ecuadorians aside from my family was when I went to New York for the first time. I was like, oh my God, like there's so many Ecuadorians. I thought it was super cool. I was like, this is amazing. But again, it's like context, right? Depending on what city you're in, what state you're in, it varies. So I really appreciate that you're very much like we were kind of chatting before we got started, that you're very much an IE kind of girl, and that's cool. That's awesome.
Yeah. I guess,
That's
yeah,
great.
I mean, culturally, that's where I put a lot of my identity because
That's cool.
similarly to like broader racial and like ethnic group cultures, like
Hmm.
the Inland Empire is, especially for Mexican Americans out there, it's like such a
Hmm.
subculture, right? Like it's very different than East LA Chicanos and very
Hmm.
different than like when I lived in the East Coast for college and just very different than even like the Mexican American culture I was seeing out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, yeah,
Exactly.
to your point, I do really heavily identify with being from the IE, but I always just tell people to explain to me the best that than any other like thing I could tell you.
And so, for anyone who's listening who's not from the LA area, LA County, etc., LA is a very fascinating place because every little pocket is different. You know, it's ginormous. Like I can't even explain like what a huge, massive like area of land LA County and all of the different cities within the city. It's unique, and so it's pretty significant for Danielle to specify like IE. And funny enough, actually, I usually do mention when I'm talking to people like, "Oh, where in LA are you from?" Like Koreatown. If you know, you know, right? Like Koreatown's a very specific neighborhood in Los Angeles. It's not Beverly Hills, it's not Glendale, it's Koreatown. So, and this is before it got very gentrified. I grew up here
Mhm.
before it got very posh and fancy to live here. So, yeah, it's interesting. LA is such a fascinating place.
No, it truly is, and I mean, I love K-Town, and I also love like MacArthur Park, which is like right next to
Yeah.
them.
Hmm.
Because I think to your point, I used to when I first moved to Los Angeles and I was trying to get civically engaged, MacArthur Park. I was on the MacArthur Park Neighborhood Council because I was living right
Oh, wow.
underneath K-Town.
Wow.
And I loved that area because at the time it was one of the only predominantly Spanish neighborhood councils. So like
Hmm.
It also was like super it was also a lot of community members who had like immigrated and been in that
Yes.
community for like 20 to 30 years. Like, so
Mhm.
there's just a lot of rich history there and
Yeah,
historical, like political understanding. And so
totally.
I loved it. One of my favorite LA memories. But to your
That's
point,
so cool.
it's just very distinct and culturally just
Mhm.
super, um, just like super different, but also just so close knit. So it kind of
Mhm.
reminded me a lot of the Inland Empire, where I have a lot more community connections and maybe than I even have here in LA.
Yeah. Danielle, do you wanna since we're kind of talking about, the work that you do you wanna share a little bit more as far as, like, the work that you're doing now? That would be awesome.
Yeah, I'm a social impact consultant. I actually own my own social impact firm. So this is exciting
Okay.
because
Mhm.
being an entrepreneur is not on my list of what I thought my life path would bring me, but
Mm.
it has been fun because I get to do a lot of work in the social impact space. And when I say social impact, I really look at this and the lens I bring to this is how
Mhm.
do we take issues that society is facing and solve them with input and insight from people who are most impacted by that issue. And so
Mhm. Mhm.
I've been able, what I really like is picking clients or social problems that I'm really committed to. So
Yeah,
right now I have like a portfolio in immigration and getting women into like governmental like workforce development,
great.
um, getting more women represented in electoral politics this year, and so
Mm.
just like looking at that holistically, I feel personally like peaceful at peace with
Yeah.
the impact that I'm making in the world. Where so this is exciting, but what all of this to means is I just help people do social impact things that they are really aligned with, and for me also that make me feel really excited
Yeah.
about changing the world in that direction.
Yeah, that's so awesome. That's really wonderful. Yeah, I mean, there's there's so much going on. It's kind of like, I don't know, sometimes I'm like, where do we even begin? Like, it's just like so many issues happening, and there's a lot of work to be done for sure. But that's really exciting that that you're working in that field and you're helping people kind of make their dreams, happen, like they're the change, right? To make the change happen. So that's very cool. I love it.
Yeah, it's super cool. I mean,
Yeah.
I was a teacher first, and then I
Oh.
moved into government being a policy director. So
Mhm.
for me, I think I've always worked in like the social impact space in my whole career, and I
Mhm.
feel actually super grateful for that. Like I've never
Yeah.
really had to really question my values, really question where the energy, like my life force energy is going,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
Like it started developing kids and like
mhm.
making sure they like for me I was a math teacher and a social studies teacher, so like
Oh,
making sure
cool. That's sweet.
historically they were accurate and mathematically they were accurate. But I think I feel really blessed actually. And so now that I'm in this, I started, I guess, teaching when I was 22. Now that I'm 12 years into this whole field, I feel
Mhm,
really excited to now be starting to lead things and to be able to have my vision or the
mhm,
work that I'm doing lead to a broader vision I have for the world.
mhm.
So I feel like the most empowered. Honestly, I felt in the trajectory of my whole career, even though I've been very grateful to have been super values aligned
Yeah,
this whole time.
yeah. That's amazing. I really do feel like well, I can call them like chapters, right? These chapters of life, they prepare you. You learn about yourself, you learn about like what you want, you learn about all kinds of things like on the road, I feel like. And so that's really cool that you had that experience of teaching too. Nice.
Yeah. Yeah. This chapter is my
Nice.
favorite chapter so far.
Good. I love that. Very cool. So let's see. So another topic that I always like to cover, kind of dig into, is about religion, spirituality, broadly defined, is my favorite thing in the world. I love anything having to do with like deeper questions, meaning, experiences that are perhaps like unexplainable, all that kind of mysterious stuff. I love it. I think it's so fascinating. So I would love to hear from you as far as like your yeah, like your understanding of like spirituality, faith. If you have any practices that you feel comfortable sharing with us, that would be fabulous.
Ooh, no, absolutely. I love spirituality. I was like always like my mom was into horoscopes before it was popular.
Cool.
And,
Yeah.
just like she's super open minded about this. I also was raised in a very religious family. My dad's family is
Mm,
actually very non denominational Christian,
okay.
which is, I think, very different than having grown up super Catholic. But my mom's side is Catholic. So for me, I was
Mm.
exposed to both sides of these really dominant, like global
Major.
religions.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Exactly.
think what I grew to love from that is just the ways in which folks can have very different doctrines, but conceptualize what it means to be a good person, right? And for
Hmm.
me, the thing that helps me be like kinder in this world, and show up the way I think like somebody would say like is godly, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Is actually through more spiritual means,
Hmm.
contrary to my grandma's wishes on both sides.
Right.
And what I like about spirituality, which I wasn't able to find in, just Bible study or the types times I really tried to dig deep and create a relationship with God, is that
Yeah.
I felt like it wasn't physically making me feel better. But the things that were things that were
Yeah.
super tangible, like therapy, understanding my brain structure and like the things that can help
Mm.
move it. It was like
Hmm.
understanding, the inner child work and like going through and feeling those emotions. It was
Yeah.
yoga, like it was incense. It was things that were bringing me
Hmm.
back
Hmm.
for me to my body. And I
Yeah.
had like a very chaotic childhood. My parents were teen parents. And so,
Mm.
regardless of they were good parents or not, like they were young. Like, and so there were things
Very
that
different. Yeah.
they messed up on. And so,
Mm.
like, for me, it was that piece of spirituality, of the really tangible, bringing me back to my body, really
Hmm.
understanding energetic centers, understanding them through the lens of both real, like spirituality, religion, and like science, that made me feel the most empowered, but also like makes me feel deep emotions that I wasn't in my earlier years really truly feeling consistently,
Hmm.
like joy.
Mm.
Um,
Hmm.
and so I think this question is my favorite because I think that for me, spirituality, in the way I conceptualize it now, is like what helps me, what are the tools I can use that
Hmm.
really helps me show up in the world the way, in the world that makes me kinder and a more active community member and able to hold
Hmm.
space for others and just
Yeah.
embody what I think like I love so much about, the religion and the examples
Yeah.
that I got growing up around like Jesus and like God, etc. So I
Hmm.
feel like I'm the most empowered to show up in that version of myself, but it was actually spiritual tools that took me there and not quite religious doctrine, which I think is interesting.
It is. It is. I love that. That's amazing. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, religion is so fascinating. I think it's true. Like and I say this while confirming that like I'm still a practicing Roman Catholic, right? Um Unfortunately, a lot of times churches don't do a great job as far as like helping people feel welcome, being more grounded in the day-to-day struggles that people are going through, you know what I'm saying? And so I get it. Like I understand like why people prefer to sort of move on, disconnect from it, etc. Because like you said, like a lot of times it's not helpful, right? Um and it's true. Like I think that we can have a connection with, and again people call it different things, the universe, god, etc., in a lot of different ways. And for me, I'm like, whatever connection, whatever works for you, that's awesome. I don't think it has to be all done the same way necessarily. I'm definitely of the opinion of like, let's use all the resources, right? Like, let's do traditional therapy, psychology, let's do meditation, let's do yoga, let's go to church once in a while, right? Like I'm just like all of the avenues, like let's go for it. Because it's true, because life is complex, we have physical, um spiritual, mental, like we're made up of all these different things. And so sometimes we have to address these different things in different ways, right? And so, yeah, I love what you shared. That's super cool. Yeah, spirituality is awesome.
Oops. Yeah, and one of my favorite books on this actually is, because I think for me, when I think about spirituality, I really wanted to make it work. But growing up in the IU, it was a very Republican centered community, and a lot of those values don't sit with my natural, just who I was as like a young child. Like I was very compassionate
Yeah.
always. I was very
Mhm.
wanting to make sure people were not suffering unnecessarily. And this is just like who I came into this life as, right? And I
Right, right.
felt like when I would engage with churches back home, it's where I was seeing a lot of like, just like the shadows of humanity, right? Like as somebody
Mhm,
who was Mexican American growing up in a
mhm.
predominantly white community, it was comments about folks in my race, right? It
Yeah,
was the microaggressions about me
right.
being the exception to
Mm.
all of these things. And these things really made me deeply question like
Yeah,
the institution of, at least for at that time,
for
like
sure.
non-denominational Christian institutions, because I was like, how is it that you say, and now I'm reading the same book you are, right? And how is it that we're seeing the world so differently? And I think what I
Mhm.
like
Yeah.
about spirituality is that it made me that person that I saw in the text, right? It made me like more compassionate. It made me be able to really show up and help others while they were suffering. My favorite book on this topic, actually, and like I think it's why when I do social impact work, I focus so much on the political and the systemic, is
Mhm.
because like I just think that like for me, policy and policy making is like a natural form of like the divine, right? Like it's
Mhm.
really working as it really for me helps me really put into practice like to create a world that I want to see for folks and to then being
Fantastic. Yeah,
called into that divine
sure,
whatever
sure.
that is that you attribute
It's your calling.
or
Yeah,
that is your
exactly.
calling.
Mhm.
100. My
Yeah.
favorite book on this though is A Public Faith. It's by a professor at the
Oh.
Yale Divinity School. And so what Professor Wolf talks about in this book that I think like I really would love to dig into is that a lot of people when they go through faith through institutions, they think like I show up on Sunday or Saturday or whatever. I get the message from my religious leader and
Mhm.
then I'm good, right? And
And
then
you're
I
done. Yeah.
operate business as
Exactly.
usual,
Yeah.
Monday through whenever. And what I
Right.
like about this book is it really understands both the role of religious
Mhm.
institutions, particularly like the Catholic Church in times of
Mhm.
famine, and why we see fluxes to like religious institutions, and what he believes is like the misinterpretation of like doctrine, right? So he
Exactly.
believes that like
Yeah.
we should go to church. It should be the area where we strategize with others who have like
Mhm.
beliefs, and
Yeah.
we should then like really understand that when God talks about like like oh I'll rescue you from something, or when God talks about intervening and putting you on a new path, people think it's going to just like happen by accident, like somebody else is going to do it, and he really charges us to think like you are the person God put in here,
You
and
are the
so
hands.
you're
Exactly.
the hand, yes.
Yeah.
And so if
Yeah.
you see someone hungry, it is your responsibility to help feed
Mhm.
them, right? And if we
Totally.
moved to do that, we would more, he doesn't say this, but this is what I interpreted, like we would more
Yeah.
accurately fall into the doctrine of what we're reading. And I
Yeah.
think it's interesting too, is in this book, he uses why people like have that gap between the values that they go to church for and then the values that they
The
show
daily
up in
life. Yeah.
their life.
Disconnect. Mhm.
But
Mhm.
he says, like, what I thought was interesting is he uses membership into a religious institution as an economic signal for safety. So people,
Mm.
regardless if they are safe, know that there is some signal that
Mhm.
you will get resources, that these people will be safe, and these people will be more likely to have your values than some random person. I think
Yeah.
that piece of it was super interesting to me because I think to our conversation here, like,
Yeah.
that was kind of the disconnect I was feeling in the church.
Mhm.
And I recognize that it's just a powerful social convener.
Mhm.
Like, for
Absolutely.
people, and it's
Yeah.
political.
Yeah, absolutely. Like one of the things I talk about all the time, especially in my teaching, I'm like, look, y'all, it kind of doesn't matter whether or not a person's religious. Having some knowledge of how religion functions in the world is important. Religion and culture are very tied together. As we have seen, especially recently, religion and politics are going hand in hand. Again, whether we like it or not, to be to be aware, to be conversant in those issues, I think is very important. And yeah, like you were saying, it's true. Like churches historically they have been at certain times, but they could do an even better job at supporting, advocating, doing something, etc. Right? In theology, that's why I really one of the things that I fell in love with theology was, for example, like Latin American liberation theology. People like Gustavo Gutierrez, John Sobrino, that they were witnessing the poverty and violence in Latin America, especially during the civil wars, and they're like, "Hey, people of God, churches, we got to do something here because people are dying. You know what I mean? Like people are suffering and dying, and no one's doing anything. I think of like, for example, like Archbishop Oscar Romero, who's now a saint, actually. Yeah, the action, right? Like the action piece, like the faith in action, is very important. And for some reason, it's so easy to sort of disconnect the two, right? Again, like you said, people feel very good about showing up to the building of the church every Sunday. And I often use the example, I'm like, yeah, the people who go to church and as they're walking outside, they're stepping over the homeless person, unhoused person, on the way out. And they just don't see the connection between what they just learned or, the gospel message versus like helping people in real life. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like
Yeah.
a lot of folks, I think, I look at the role of government, and we talk
Yeah.
about,
Totally.
I think right now in the US we have what I think is a distortion of like what like religious, specifically like Christian doctrines
Totally.
talks about. But I
Yeah.
think what's interesting is like people think government will come and step in, and the government obviously is created to solve social issues. That's one of the
Mm-hmm.
main functions of government. But they really take out their personal responsibility. And if you're not going to
Totally.
directly do direct service, you do have a responsibility to vote. You do have a
Yeah.
responsibility to vote for folks who will take care and want to use governmental resources to take care of really deep society issues. Here in LA County,
Yes.
homelessness is one of the most pressing issues, right?
Yeah.
And you're going to want to elect folks who are like have expertise in that, know how to do that easily, know how government works, know how to get something done in a really complicated human
Yeah.
management system. And
Sure.
I think
Yeah.
like that's what I feel like people are really not understanding. Like the
Mm-hmm.
basic citizenry and like
The
when
basic point. Mm-hmm.
the basic
Mm-hmm.
point that you can actually like engage with the divine is actually just
Right.
voting for folks who will do what they say they're going to do at government. And
Yeah.
too often all the research says like, the like most likely candidates to win are people who are charming, people who are really have like really steady talking points that are sexy, right? And I'm like, people get caught up in like the glitz and glamour, but it's like, who is
Sure.
that person? What is their track record? Like, let's take out what you feel. Like, if you feel someone's funny or not, does not make them a good
That's not
leader,
the point.
right?
Right, 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 right. Yeah.
But
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
really, your duty is your due diligence, and that's like the easiest form I think of when I think
Yeah.
about my work as like something that brings me a deep form of like closeness to God, source, whoever. I'm like, this is basic. Like, if you're a religious
Mhm.
person, you should always be voting, and you should always be voting for candidates who are going to use governmental resources in the act that, in the way that's going to increase the highest amount of public good we can from those resources. That's my
Totally.
personal opinion, but I won't
I
sway from
agree. Yeah, yeah. I agree with you.
it.
You know, for me, I'm just like, don't people want to live in a peaceful world? I know that we can't get it perfect, but don't you kind of want to see all children get an education, basic, food, like housing? That seems pretty reasonable to me, right? But for some reason, even
Yeah.
that, right? That's a we cannot get people on board, right? We cannot get people on board, and that is where I struggle, right? I'm like, how, like that's where I struggle. I'm like, do people not see that we are all interconnected? Do we not see that we all are sharing one planet? We it behooves us actually. It behooves us to get along, at least semi get along, right?
Yeah,
So
and I think
yeah,
honestly, this is like where I think maybe religion needs to like move towards, and like recommendations for any religious leaders
sure,
looking at this. But to your point, we should want that, right? Cognitive
yeah,
distortions and bias and like the way our brains trick us is so real.
hmm
Like, trick
yeah,
us into thinking that we're not connected, trick us into
no,
thinking that that issue is not a me issue. And honestly, I think one of the most like terrifying rhetorics is tricking us into thinking that somebody who is suffering chose to suffer,
Mhm.
right? Like somebody who is experiencing homelessness chose not to pay their rent. When the
Right.
For me, the issues are so much more systemic, right? When we look at
Absolutely. Absolutely.
all of the data, right? And this is my master's of public policy talking. When we look at all the data nationally, the workforce data, if you're
Mhm.
making 90K in the US, you're in like the top 15% of workers and
Mhm.
earners in the nation. Like,
Mhm.
that's really scary. That means like 85% of people are earning less than that. Like,
Right.
$90,000 is not
Six
enough.
figures is like minimum. Six figures is like, kind of like getting to be like low income. That's crazy. Like that's
Yeah.
insane. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
to your point, it's like people will look at the eye and be like, oh, okay, well, somebody who chose not to pay a $3,000 rent
Yeah.
must have not been working hard enough. And I'm like, we only all have 24 hours in the day, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't think it's that. I think it's the rate of wages in the United States when you look at that data
For
in
sure. Yeah.
comparison to the rate in which housing costs have increased, especially rental
It's
costs,
a huge
not even
issue.
just
Yeah.
mortgages, right? So to
Yeah.
me, that's where I'm saying like, your brain is real and will trick you into thinking
Mhm.
this is a moral problem when actually it's just a systemic problem.
It's more of a systemic problem. Totally. Totally. Yeah.
It's
It's
actually very rational. It's like very like logical.
it's pretty straightforward. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very straightforward, I think.
Yeah. I
But
agree.
I
I
think
agree. I agree.
to our conversation about spirituality and morality, I think is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for me, morality is just slightly different because
Mhm.
that I think is so individual based on what you think and how you live ethically,
Mhm.
right? And what that
Yeah.
means to you. And that can be informed by both religious institutions, but heavily is informed by like things like your parents and society and like the
Mhm.
like area you grew up in, right?
Mhm.
Your
Mhm.
friends and what they believe. And so I think that is super interesting to me because I think that's where people really trick themselves into thinking that we don't have enough abundance in this world to take care of everyone or to live
Exactly.
really concretely in these religious doctrines.
Exactly. Exactly. We use that term lack mindset. That is a huge underlying issue. We hear the rhetoric of like, oh, they're taking our jobs. Da, 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 da. Da. I was like,
Yeah,
like I doubt it, right? For a lot of different reasons. Yeah, without getting too deep into it, but it's true. Like people feel like such a fierce competition. Like, oh, they're taking this, they're taking. It's like no, actually, like there's enough. Like there is actually enough. For some reason, I'm thinking about during the pandemic how people were grabbing everything that they could, leaving nothing for others. And it was so fascinating to me. I'm sure you saw footage too of like in other countries, it wasn't quite that way, right? There was something, in other words, there was something quite particular. We'll say like in a Target or a Walmart, something was going on in the air, let's say, in the behavior is what I'm getting at, right? The behavior of like the panic, buying everything up, leaving nothing for others. That just for me, that was just like such a powerful example of how the average US person doesn't see the connections to their neighbor, right? The lack of sense of neighbor is gone,
I
it's very sad.
totally agree with you there
It's
because I
very
even
sad.
think like that like pandemic behavior we're seeing was like resource guarding, right?
Yeah,
Make
of
sure
course.
that
Yeah.
you have what you need.
Protecting for themselves. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think that's just such a deep American psyche. There is like a French marketer that's very famous, but I think what was interesting about when I read through like this book that he wrote about how he helped like Subaru and Jeep increase sales across like
Oh, well.
globally.
Mm-hmm.
He really uses the psyche of a country and then markets it with like an image. So Jeep is an example, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
blanking on his name, but he helped Jeep increase their sales like 400% because
Oh.
when they did focus groups with Americans, they realized that Jeeps represented like the Wild West. So every time they pictured a Jeep, it was like mountains, anything where you would put a horse, they put a Jeep because it activated the American psyche
Mm-hmm.
to that really valued that kind of westward movement to think like, oh, I
Mm-hmm.
want that, right? That's something that's
Mhm,
deeply
mhm,
American.
mhm,
But and it represented freedom. And
mhm.
but when they did these focus groups on freedom in Europe, a lot of folks would say like, oh, actually freedom was the US tanks that came to let us know that World War II had ended. And
Whoa,
so
interesting.
so different, right? So
Fascinating. Wow.
they would then market Jeeps on images that represented like that World War II era ending, like in the same locations or in the,
Wow.
yeah, because they kind
That's
of look
interesting.
like, you know, American
Interesting.
tanks. And so I thought that was so interesting to talk about psyche of a country. And
Oh,
this obviously was to make money,
yeah.
but I think like we can apply this lesson to the like
Yeah.
religious and spiritual context where it's like deeply American to not value your neighbor. Like it's deeply American to
Yeah.
think there is a problem. But I also think like the bigger problem we have in America, and I see this in politics all the time, is like we really value money
Mhm.
over community, and we really value money.
Money over everything. Yep.
Yeah, and how much
Yep.
money we make, and like that
Profit
I
over
think
people.
is a
Yep. Mhm.
deeply
Mhm.
American psyche that I now we're
Wow.
seeing just such the harmful impacts of that, and the harmful
Yeah.
impacts of that, particularly in the immigrant community who's being targeted by that. I think to your question, like that to me is always like, yeah, like there is a better way. Like
There
we
has to be, man. You know, it's like there
need
has to be.
to,
There's gotta be. There's gotta be other solutions. Oh my gosh. Oh, this has been amazing, Danielle. This is so fun. This is so great. So as we're kind of wrapping up, I wanted to ask you, my kind of third question of these interviews is about the inner child. So I think the inner child work is so important. As we know, ask any psychologist, like childhood is so obviously, it's kind of like obvious at this point, right? Childhood is so foundational for all of us, right? The good, the bad, the ugly. And so I love asking my guests about their reflections. So in reflection, like what advice would you give to your inner child, your inner Nina? And then if you would like to share, like what advice would you give to young women today? It's rough out there. It's rough out there to be a teenager, 20 something year old. Like there's a lot going on. So
mm.
I would love to hear kind of like those reflections and those like inner wisdom that you might want to share with us.
Yeah, this is such a good question. I'm like
Thanks.
thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done so much inner child work that I will say this to like my younger self is like start earlier, right? Like a
Interesting.
lot of this is formed when you're under 10, and a lot of
Mm,
it is like deeply subconscious. And
yeah.
so, you know, just I think like I spent a good portion of my 20s in particular,
Hmm.
navigating
Hmm.
my inner, like my feelings and understanding like why I was the way I was or why I was feeling the way I was feeling. And a lot of it pointed to like,
Totally.
I just needed to grieve moments when I was younger and things that happened when I was younger fully.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so I would say, like, if you're scared or if you are feeling things like anxiousness or, you know, you have things you are that are kind of blocking like your
Hmm.
happiness, like
Hmm.
just start earlier. Just like go to YouTube, get the meditation, find a free
Yeah.
one,
Yeah.
use your if you're at school, use your campus resources, talk to a mental
Hmm.
health therapist.
Hmm.
I think the other thing I would say to my younger self is that a lot of my trauma was deeply somatic, and I
Mm.
didn't even know that. So I was using a lot of Western and like dominant culture like healing practices at
Methods.
first. So
Mhm,
that was
mhm,
like therapy, which there is such a time and place for therapy, but what I've learned is that therapy was helping me not internalize the emotions of something in
mhm.
the present, but it wasn't addressing what I had already gone through and I had already stored in my body. And
Right.
I had read a book, The Body Keeps the Score, which was pivotal to
Yeah.
shifting my personal
Mhm,
healing.
mhm.
Yeah, and it's great. It's
It's a powerful book.
deeply
Yeah.
powerful and also like
Mhm,
goes through a lot of like really heavy concepts, but that
mhm.
really showed me that what I was feeling was somatic, but also biological, right? Like it was
Mm.
healing the like interconnections like between my brain network, and it was like
Yeah.
doing things like yoga, and it was allowing
Mhm.
my body to feel safe enough to then release these emotions. And so
Yeah.
I think for me, that's the two recommendations. Like one, start your inner child work early, and two, the first step to that is really identifying what pathway of healing would be
Mhm,
necessary for you,
mhm,
and like how can you like just start there. And if you don't know, like let's say it's too overwhelming, start with somatic first, right?
mhm,
Start with
mhm,
your
mhm.
yoga first, start with like your walks and your slow movements.
Yeah.
Start with helping your like feeding your brain all the good nutrients. Like start with that first,
Yeah.
and then pair that with like talk therapy, or for me, EDMR is so helpful.
Oh yeah.
And pair that with the therapy that is more fitting to like what you've experienced in your childhood.
Right.
So that's my first
Yeah.
recommendation. That's what I would tell my younger self.
I love it.
Start early. And don't go through the journey of trying to figure out what works. There's been so much research out now.
Yeah, there is a lot of research. I would chime in too, like, don't give up on yourself, because
Yeah.
sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it takes time for it to click. For example, like I'll say, like, there's certain insights or messages that I've heard for a really long time, right? From different people, be it like a blip on YouTube, a friend saying it. It's been like in my consciousness,
Mhm.
but it didn't sink in, right? It didn't sink in, or
Yeah.
it didn't really click until more recently. And it's okay. You know what I mean? Like, so in other words, like, give yourself grace, be patient with yourself, and don't give up on yourself. Like, keep it's a process. In other words, yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I actually really appreciate that because when I think about when I truly started my healing path, and again, I've
Hmm.
been like super interested in like religion and spirituality prior to this, but when I truly started to
Yeah.
like lock in,
Yeah.
it took 6 years for my very first therapy session until I really started. And then I went through and switched my healing to more
Hmm.
somatic. And it took about
Hmm.
a good 3 to 4 years for my body then to register safety. So I think, like,
Wow.
to your point, like,
Yeah.
but it was just showing up on my yoga mat every day and being like, I'm
Yeah.
just feel good after, and I feel
Hmm. Hmm.
different, and just noticing and relying on those subtle shifts. But I would say, like, now that I'm, what, 8 years into that whole journey, I
Yeah.
feel the best I've ever felt. Like, I
That's
don't,
awesome.
like, I think about my younger self and I was like, whoa, talk about suffering. She was suffering a lot, and I didn't even know it. Like, I
Hmm.
didn't even know that there was another side of this. So to your point, yeah,
Hmm.
just keep going one step at a time, one yoga
One
practice
day
at
at a
a
time.
time, one session at a time. Just even if you skip and go a month later, like, go.
Yeah. It's okay. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Life happens, we get busy, but pick it up again. You know what I mean? Like, whatever it is, like, it's awesome. Yeah, that's awesome. Oh, this was
No,
lovely.
this is
Thank
so
you so much,
fun.
Danielle. Yeah, this was fantastic. Oh my gosh. So thank you, folks who are listening. I appreciate you joining today. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. So new episodes of the podcast are available every Wednesday. The audio is available wherever you listen to your podcast. So that includes Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, etc. There's lots of platforms. And then the video of the interview is always available on YouTube. I upload the videos on YouTube, and they're available on Wednesdays at 1 Pacific time PM. I love my angel numbers. So that's when they're available. And Danielle, where can folks find you online if they wanted to get in
Oh,
touch?
you can add me on LinkedIn. Very active there. You can also follow me on Instagram. At Danielle.Guillen. Um, that's it.
Perfect. Awesome. And I'll make sure to tag Danielle when I upload everything.
Perfect.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Thank you,
Thank
Danielle,
you.
for being an amazing guest.
All right.
Take care.
Bye.